Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow as he locked up his workshop for the night. The setting sun cast long shadows across his backyard, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree that loomed over his small wooden shed. He'd spent the entire day working on a commission piece, an intricate chess set for a wealthy collector, and exhaustion tugged at his muscles. As he trudged back to the house, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced back at the shed, its weathered planks bathed in the fading orange light. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw movement in one of the windows, but he quickly dismissed it as a trick of the light. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of his stomach as he entered his home and prepared for bed. The next morning, Thomas rose early, eager to continue his work. He shuffled across the dewy grass, fumbling with his keys as he approached the shed. The moment he stepped inside, he froze. There on his workbench sat a small wooden figure he had never seen before. It was crudely carved, barely 4 inches tall, depicting a hunched, misshapen human form. Its features were rough and alien, with 2 long limbs and a face that seemed to grimace in pain. Thomas picked it up carefully, turning it over in his calloused hands. The wood was warm to the touch, as if it had just been carved. "What the?" he muttered, setting the figure back down. He was certain he hadn't made it. The style was all wrong, and he had never left projects unfinished. Yet here it was, sitting innocently among his tools as if it had always been there. Thomas spent the rest of the day working on his chess set, but his concentration was shot. His eyes kept darting to the strange figure, and more than once he caught himself reaching for it, drawn to its unsettling form. As night fell, Thomas hesitated before locking up. On impulse, he grabbed the figure and took it with him, unable to bear the thought of leaving it in the shed overnight. The next morning, his blood ran cold as he entered the workshop. Another figure sat on the bench, identical to the first, but slightly larger. Thomas's eyes darted to his pocket where the original figure still rested. His hands trembled as he picked up the new carving, noting its unnatural warmth. This pattern continued for days. Each morning, Thomas would find a new figure in his workshop, each one larger and more detailed than the last. He lined them up on a shelf, watching with growing dread as they seemed to evolve before his eyes. The carvings grew more human-like, their expressions shifting from pain to something that looked unsettlingly like hunger. Thomas stopped sleeping. He spent his nights huddled in his house, staring out the window at the shed. Sometimes he thought he saw shadows moving inside, heard the faint scraping of wood against wood, but every time he worked up the courage to investigate, he found nothing but his tools and the ever-growing collection of figures. On the 7th night, Thomas couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer, he crept out to the shed just before midnight. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle. A noise from inside made him freeze. It was the unmistakable sound of a chisel on wood. Thomas burst through the door, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. What he saw made him stumble backward in horror. The figures were alive, dozens of them, from the tiny first carving to ones nearly as tall as he was, all moving with jerky wooden movements. They surrounded his workbench, where the largest figure, easily 7 feet tall, stood hunched over a piece of wood. As Thomas watched, paralyzed with fear, the giant figure turned. Its face was a twisted mirror of his own, carved in exquisite detail. In its hands, it held a nearly complete wooden figure, a figure that looked exactly like Thomas. The giant's mouth opened, a sound like splintering wood filling the air as it spoke.
"Join us, Creator. Your flesh is weak, but in wood you will be eternal.
The smaller figures surged forward, their wooden hands grasping at Thomas's clothes, his skin. He felt their touch burning as if their very essence was seeping into him. As he struggled, he felt his joints stiffen, his skin hardening. Thomas tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw before his eyes turned to smooth, dark knots was the giant figure placing the finished carving on the workbench, a perfect wooden replica of himself, terror forever etched on its face. The next morning the shed stood silent. Inside, a new set of wooden figures lined the shelves, with the largest, a strikingly lifelike carving of a man, standing proudly in the center. And on the workbench, a small, crude figure began to take shape under invisible hands, the first of a new cycle, ready to begin.